I'm Simon McBurney, and I'm the artistic director of Complicité, and we have a long relationship with Hawkwood, and we're doing yet another workshop, which will be a series of workshops over the coming years, which we do on a fairly regular basis. But one of the wonderful things about being at Hawkwood is you're surrounded by an extraordinary ecosystem of the most amazing indigenous natural trees and plants, as well as some plants, because it's a Victorian house, which are more exotic. Here I'm actually standing next to a walnut tree, and so one of the interesting things about any trees or plants that we see all around us is they have not only a literal significance in that this produces walnuts, but also a metaphorical and symbolic meaning. This, I think, a walnut's called a Juglans regia, I think that's its Latin name, which means, essentially, it means, in Roman terms, it means the tree of Jupiter, and regia meaning king, so it's associated with a kind of, it has a spiritual dimension, but also the walnut is a tiny little nut which looks rather similar to the size and the scale of a brain, and also the same sort of form with all its little lines and irregularities. The walnut, of course, like any tree, is part of the living world, part of the living system, which at one point in our history, or rather prehistory, was integrated into our lives in a way which is almost impossible to imagine now. So, for example, the show that I've just done, Mnemonic, in it you have a Neolithic man who used 17 different types of wood, who knew and understood all the plants that surrounded him and his people, so that there were not only their food but their medicines, not only their medicines but their tools. Everything had, and there was a fundamental understanding that linked him to the living world around him. And people before him, before the Neolithic era, the Paleolithic era, of course, the idea of there being any difference between you and the living world was unthinkable, just as it's still unthinkable for indigenous people who live very, very far still from the modern world. There are still many, many uncontacted tribal peoples all over the world. So we, in our world, here, mine, are very far from what we think of as the living world. I've just started to talk about its symbolic significance. But one of the most important aspects of theatre and playing and coming together to play with theatre is that we are constantly engaged in a process of connection. That's partly what theatre is about, is connecting people up. When you sit in a theatre, one of the things that has been discovered by a group of researchers in Chicago is that at a certain moment, people in the theatre, their hearts will begin to beat together. So one of the aspects of theatre, live theatre, as opposed to watching something on a screen, which you are doing now, which is very, very different, is that you are in the same place at the same space at the same time. And something begins to happen in terms of the way that you connect up with each other. And this is fundamental in terms of any artistic or cultural activity. We are engaged in an action which is, in a sense, in opposition to the world that we live in, which is dominated by the narrative of mass consumer capitalism, which wishes to separate us from everything. So this workshop, in a sense, is about connecting not only you, the people in the room, with how you work, how you play, how you think about things, with the extraordinary leadership of Joyce Henderson, who's worked with the company now for about 35 years, but also taking those questions outside of the group and into, very simply, the world that surrounds us, and seeing the connections, touching the connections, or perhaps being able to acknowledge the disconnect with the world around us, but simply raising our consciousness and asking the question, so, as performers, as artists, how do we start to reconnect not only with ourselves, but with everything that surrounds us? Because unless we connect, kind of doomed. I hope you have a wonderful time.